We're going to be talking about lens flare characteristics. So this is ZEISS and Panavision together are going to do a presentation on lens flare characteristics today. So my name is Snehal Patel, and I have here with me Al Collins. Al, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm the lens technician over at Panavision Chicago. I've been with them for a number of years, and just want to try to share what we know with you.
Yeah. And I'm with ZEISS, the head of cinema sales for North and South America. And we have recently developed lenses with flare characteristics. They're actually manufactured to do that on purpose, which is the Supreme Prime Radiance lenses. Al, you have a show right now that's using the Radiance lenses, correct?
Yes. Which one is it?
The Robert McLaughlin show?
Right. It's Light Years. Pretty good show. It's looks like it's going to be an interesting show. They have the Radiance lenses, and they've had no complaints.
Well, that's good to hear. And of course, Chicago was actually one of the first towns to use Radiance lenses, even when there were prototypes in 2019. Dana Gonzalez used them on Fargo season 2, so he chose them as the primary lens series for that show as well. Not necessarily just for the flare characteristics, but also because of the way they changed the skin tones. He really liked what they did for his Technicolor look, so that was like a big part of why he used them. So it's really interesting. We have a nice little history here with Chicago. So just so you know, Al and I both have been in the industry for a while, in Chicago actually. I started out in film and television in Chicago myself, having gone to Columbia College. Al, you've worked at tons of rental, we were just talking about this, so many rental houses in Chicago. Can you list them again one more time?
So from beginning to end, I guess there's Victor Duncan, which was also a Panavision vendor, and then I went to Schumacher Camera, which was a smaller, more boutique house, and then I went on to Fletcher Camera, and they were just getting into film at the end of film's career, it seems. We ended up with a lot of red cameras and going on to the D21 and Alexas by the time I left Fletcher Chicago. And then I've also had a stint over at Fujinon for a time, and then back to Panavision. So it's been a long run, and an interesting one to see all the lens technology, the changes, and the camera changes.
And Al's a consummate lens person for sure, because I mean, if you walk into his office, he's got a nice workbench. He's got these cool wooden drawers full of all his parts that are labeled, and he's always tearing down some lens. So obviously, he has a love for optics, and I'm very honored to be with him today to be able to talk about what we're going to talk about. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to define, first of all, what is flares and how are they created. That'll be the first job today. And then secondly, we're going to show you examples of how flares are implemented, both in the Panavision side. So Al's got a list of different comparison images from all different types of Panavision glass. And then we're going to talk about how in the modern day, ZEISS made the Radiance lenses, which is very specifically designing flare characteristics for lenses. And I think you'll get a pretty good idea of both vintage and modern day, kind of how it all works and what the choices are. I mean, I think it's super exciting because, the one complaint that we're getting, I think, from cinematographers is that these sensors are just so clean, right? And people really want to have textures, and not for everything. Sometimes you just want a nice, clean palette to start from. You have a good quality Panavision lens or a good quality ZEISS lens like a Supreme Prime, and things are just clean and neat. But sometimes you just want to mess it up a little bit. So we're going to show you how to do that.
I think that with film, we had one medium. It wasn't that great of a medium. Mm-hmm. And then we went on and we got the digital medium, and that was much more clean and had a lot more, it was just a better medium in general for collecting information from the lens. So now I think we have, the need to kind of dial things back sometimes to make things look more like what we see in our human eye.
Yeah, exactly. And then also, like you said about the film plane, you didn't have a perfect medium, but you had choices. You had film stock, right? And then even the body of the camera that you use had a specific flutter to it, right?
Right. I think you really hit on something there. I think that when we had film, that was what we worked with, or we used as, now we use lenses because the medium is so good. Before it was the medium that we used, so we could change film stocks. And we could do whatever we wanted to with film stocks. We could flash it.
Yeah.
We could do all kinds of different things with the film stock.
Oh, really? Yeah, so, why don't you here, let's just do this. Jeff, let's leave it. We don't need to do a keynote, we can just leave it here.
I'm opening a keynote.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So yes, absolutely having the choice of camera system, having the choice of film stock from Fuji or Kodak or whoever you wanted, filtration, right? So DPs had a lot of different things to choose from to be able to, make choices as to what the look is going to be, right? So the nice thing is that nowadays, yes, you don't have the same choices in terms of film stock or cameras, but you have other things you can do. You can do LUTs, you can have a DIT on set, you still have filtration, you still have optics, right, which is a very important factor. So we're going to talk about why now this is important again, the flare characteristics. So let's go ahead and define it. What is a lens flare? And we're using a very esoteric example of these, astronauts in space with the sun behind them and the Earth is lit. So I think to define lens flares, we have to define what a lens is trying to do first before how it gets broken, right? So what is a lens normally trying to do is take image, which is reflected light. So that's right now, Al and I are lit, right, by light that's reflected off of us. And what a film plane or a sensor would do was see that reflection, take it through all the optical elements and recreate an image based on angle of view. So depending on the magnification, recreate that image as an image projection on the back end onto the film plane. That's the normal job of a lens. So if you had this ideal situation where just objects were lit and just had reflective light on them, then of course the reflective light will go through, it'll follow a path, and of course each point source of light will follow its own path through all the optics and then come out the back end, right? So when you're of course setting up a lens, you want this to happen as well as possible, right? As even as possible.
Right.
And so then the next thing is, of course, the ideal situation we talked about. But in reality, of course, you're going to have a point source of light, right? In this case, it's going to be backlit because the point source is behind our actors and behind the object, which is the Earth, right? So in that case, if this was real life and you were looking with your naked eye, your theoretical naked eye, you would see this. You would see this ball of fire in the background. You would see the Earth on the left and our characters on the right. But when optics come into play, of course, Al, what happens? Flares.
A little bit of physics, yeah.
So tell us what's happening here. What is this interaction with the glass?
I mean, what we see here is that, with optics, you obviously have surfaces, and with surfaces, you have reflections. And the reflections, because you have so many different elements in a lens, you end up with many different reflections. So if you can eliminate the reflections, you can eliminate some of the flaring. Depending on whether it's direct, depending on whether it's bouncing off some element inside of the lens. It could be bouncing off an uncoated or an unpainted surface of the edge. It could be bouncing off the actual the coating. It could be bouncing off even your aperture blades. So you have all that in play, and it's just bouncing around, going crazy, and you can get all kinds of great stuff like this.
Yeah, so let's talk about the different, so Al mentioned a number of different ways that the flare characteristics are being exhibited. So let's talk about each piece separately. First, we have ghosting, which is exactly what he said, bouncing around inside the elements. So it's not just one place, it's multiple places where the light will hit a surface and there's some reflectivity in the glass. No matter how good your anti-reflective coatings are, there's gonna be some reflectivity, especially with an intense light. And you're gonna have ghosting because it's gonna bounce off of one element, light it up and bounce off, and then project itself onto an element that's in front of it. So that's what causes the shape of of the elements themselves. So here in the circle, you see what you would typically see, these flare characteristics of these kind of orbs of light that as I pan the camera, right, the stack changes, it separates and comes back together and stuff like that. That part of it is reflections from the lens element themselves. That's called ghosting. It's usually the most intense or the easiest to control if you're not pointing a light directly into the lens, but also the one that exhibits, the typical flare characteristics the most. The second one, which is what Al mentioned, is the stray light that comes off of mechanical surfaces. So especially in the older lenses or vintage lenses, you see this a lot, where it'll hit off of a metal surface or a plastic surface in the inside of the lens. And if it's not a deep matte black finish, it'll reflect a little bit, right? If not more. And if it reflects a lot, if the material is shiny, you literally start to see the shape of the barrel, right?
Yeah.
And then also, what's the second effect that it has if it hits off the surface of the edge of the barrel?
I'm not sure I know what you're referring to.
You get the decontrasting of the blacks, right?
Okay.
So it lifts the blacks up as well when you have it hitting off the mechanical surfaces. So in this case, in the circle, you see the kind of orangish, yellowish shape, the faint shape. That's actually the shape of the barrel, because this barrel seems to be pretty shiny, I would say. So it's reflecting quite a bit, and you see a distinct shape there. That shape is not gonna, it's not gonna be like a stack, like the ghosting. The ghost is like a stack, right, that comes together and comes apart again. This is going to be more like a shape that looks like you're looking down inside a barrel of something, right? And then, of course, this is a good one. This happens a lot nowadays, right? Hitting off of the low-pass filter, the optical filter. So even after light leaves the lens and goes on the other side, nowadays, you have to contend with the fact that you have a low-pass filter on your sensor, or the silicone wafer itself is going to be reflective.
We once had a problem where we had a job where we were using a film camera, and it was actually it was a key light issue, and there was a statue, and it was completely white, and it was bouncing off the ground glass and back on to the film plane. And it was a ghosting image just like this, although not created by the lens itself.
But created by the low-pass filter.
Right. I mean, in a sense, created by a low-pass filter, because it was the ground glass. The ground glass is the secondary imager in a film camera.
That's right. So, of course, the ground glass is, giving the ability to use a prism to separate the light as well, right? So itself is shiny to a degree, and it can reflect back as well.
Exactly.
Nowadays, with the low-pass filters on different camera systems, they all exhibit a little bit differently. So if you put on a red camera, you can tell when you shut down the iris a bit, you'll see distinct red shapes if there's a flare characteristic or a intense light into the lens. That's because, this is the color that their low-pass filter exhibits. In our case here, this is more like what an Alexa would do, which is give you that bluish glow around a hot light source. Bluish kind of greenish glow that you see right over there, that's actually coming from the low-pass filter, not from the lens itself. And then the other thing is you see the diffraction of the iris blades, right? So Al, can you count the diffraction blades and tell me how many blades are there in the iris? Is that possible to do?
Let's see.
This one's got a lot, it looks like.
Yeah, right. It's pretty round. Whoop. Sorry. Yeah, I don't think I can accurately count them. Not with this resolution, at least.
Not with this resolution, but you can tell that there's quite a few iris blades because they're diffracting. And that's because the wavelength of light, is being interfered with by the edge of the iris, especially when there's a contact point or a intersection. And so therefore that causes the diffraction. So all these kind of pieces together is actually what's causing the flares to happen. So if we want to define flare characteristics, it's all these things together. Right? And some things are more prominent than others. In this example you see in the bottom right, the ghosting obviously is the most prominent thing. So those are basically optical element shapes, as you're seeing reflections of those. On the top left, you see a little bit of diffraction, a little bit of ghosting as well. On the right, you see ghosting and then image of the barrel a little bit. And the bottom left, you see it's a wider lens, so the ghosts are a little bit smaller in comparison to the rest of the frame, but they're still there. You can see it on his face, and then also on the building just to the right of him. So really good examples of what they look like in real life. But lens flares are pretty and interesting and could be something that you can use to help tell your story. So people really like them, and nowadays, with like we were talking about before the session started, having the clean sensors available in the market, now the need for having some kind of texture with filtration, with lenses that have a certain type of look, and then of course your LUT to help create the look on set is something you can bake in so that DPs can preserve their intent, their artistic intent. So that's what flares look like. I'm just going to show you an example of Tobias Schliessler shot this piece called Refugee, and the rest of the shoot is done with our regular Supreme primes, but this particular scene, which is a firefight, is done with the Radiance version of the Supreme primes that has the kind of blue flare characteristics built into it. So it was kind of cool when he went to shaky cam and handheld, he also wanted to have flares. So he has that here, so you can see that, a few flare characteristics. Very subtle, but adds a little dimensionality, a little texture to the frame, makes it look like a little bit more frenetic, and things are going on. So there you see the flare characteristics exhibited once again. But I think Tobias did a really great job of kind of utilizing the look to get this. Yeah. So what we want to do now is we want to also talk about Panavision's different choices that they have in terms of what kind of flare characteristics you want. They actually have all kinds of lenses, right, that you can actually use to get those flare characteristics. So let's go through what Al has listed as some of the choices here. So let's go ahead and start this presentation. Ooh, nice animation there. Whoa. 40 millimeter T2. Okay, cool.
So this this slide represents 9 of our spherical lenses, and I think, let me see, can I get a note there? There are I think there's 14 in total. No note. Okay, let's go back. What this is doing is we have a comparison of all of our, these are all of our spherical lenses on top, and all of, let's see, yeah, so these are all of our, there's 2.
Why is it showing us so weird?
You're showing 2 different presentations at the same time.
Yeah, I don't know why.
Okay, well, let's just go with it. Just the top was our spherical lenses, the Primo.
Sorry.
That's okay. The Primo 70s, the Panaspeeds, and what's really important is when we get them all back together again, I wanted to show you like how the flare differences vary. Basically, with the Primo 70s, which is one of our newest lenses.
So sorry, I don't know what's going on.
Good? Nope.
Don't know what's going on here.
Well, in any event, basically all of our spherical lenses, they all have different flare characteristics in and of themselves. Without having any kind of manipulation, they have a flare characteristic that's unto themselves. And the reasons being is obviously design and the type of glass and whatever we've chosen to, with coatings and whatnot. And so you have a different look for each one, and some of them, like here, the H series is obviously extremely. So The H series has a lot of flare and lack of contrast, glare, when light is shot straight down the barrel. It's probably our lens with the most characteristics. It has a lot of aberrations that haven't been brought out. If you look at the 70 series, which is one of our newest series of lenses, it covers 8K as well, but with that lens, there's less characteristics. It's more contrasty. It handles light better through, when it's shot straight down the barrel. You would be very satisfied if you were looking to get away from flares, although it still flares, but the contrast is very apparent when you see them together.
I'm so sorry. I don't know why.
You want to go back into your?
No, it's splitting everything. I don't know what's.
Everything. Okay.
I don't know it's all. Yeah, maybe that's what it is.
What is it? So, Primo 70. This is our Primo 70. This is super speed, H series, standard prime. And you can see the standard prime has a lot of flare. This is the light source. She's here, she's blocking it slightly, but on the side, you're really getting this flare to come out. Let's see. I'm sorry, I don't have my note to. Anything? Do you want to go to the next slide?
Sure.
If you can. Okay, so this is a great comparison with the Primo 70s. Apparently there's a Primo 70 and a Primo 70 on top, so there's not a lot of deviation. It was supposed to be a comparison slide with the H series, so you could see what was going on. This is a nice image in that you can see now how the entrance pupil and the exit pupil execute different types of flare, meaning that when you have something coming into the lens before the aperture, that's an entrance. An exit would be after that point. Therefore, you can see at this entrance pupil, things are a lot less defined and a lot more glare and lack of contrast is being presented. Where when you have your exit pupil, things are a little bit more defined. You get color images. You're getting more color to that flare as well. Now you have veiling glare, which is that you can see the bokehs, and then you see that glare coming off the bokehs. So that's pretty much a good explanation, because every lens will exhibit those characteristics of flare, but in different manners depending on the lens and how it was manufactured. So this is the H series, and as I said, now with the H series you have a lot more veiling glare plus flare. It really handles things a lot differently. This is an older lens that we conscripted back into our inventory because they covered 8K so well, and that a lot of people really like the gentle roll off of the lens itself. So it gave a lot softer quality to people rather than a more contrasted and sharp image. This is H series was made because we wanted something a little bit more portraity, as it were.
And basically you have filtration built into the lens, so you still have the speed of the lens, right? You get the fast T-stop.
Yes.
But you get the filtered look from it that's built into it. And
so
then
it
here's
changes the whole
comparison between the two.
There's a really good comparison in how these flares are handled. You see these blue streaks here. There's these blue flares here, plus the light source and how things are being dealt with. And then you can also see Just as a side note, like not so much for flares, but just the bokeh is completely different shaped. Where you have a perfect circle up here, and then you have, because you have some compression on the sides and on the top. So it's not circular, it's not as circular as what's going on with the Primos.
You also had different iris blade numbers, right? So the Primo 70 has more iris blades and it's rounder, the shape, right? And you have less iris blades on the H series lens?
It depended on the actual focal length.
Focal length,
yeah.
okay. Got it. Anamorphics.
So this is more lenses. These are actually anamorphic lenses. So the anamorphics are going to have a completely different flare characteristic than the spherical lenses that we have in our inventory, in any inventory. So here you can see this is the G series. This was the last set of anamorphic lenses developed for film that we made. This is the E series. That was before that. This was a very popular set of lenses, the E series, D series, B series. So we have obviously A, B, C, D. So the E series and the G series, now we're up to the T series. So the C series, you can see how different some of these flares are. I mean, with this one, this lens here, the Auto Panatar B, is this was using I want to say it was using prisms instead of destigmatizers. So you have different types of, you have cylindrical types of anamorphics, and so those cylinders end up changing how the flare is created, and so now you have a streak instead of something that's a little bit less. You have no real streak here. The blue streaks are all made because you have cylindrical anamorphic elements inside of the lens.
I'm going to go back quickly to the
Sure.
to the spherical so that we could show the spherical comparison again to see the difference.
So this is the spherical comparison, and the Primo 70 is one of our newer lens releases, or it's the Panaspeeds. The Primos are older. They're more in the 70s, not 70s, but in the late 80s they were developed. In the 90s they were really put into the workforce there. These are more the super speeds, the super speed Zs, the ultra speed Zs. These are older lenses that we continue to use because people really like what's going on in the frame in addition to the flares. So you can, again, because these are all spherical, you end up having a completely different flare pattern than you would have with the anamorphic types.
And the ultra speed Z and the super speed Z are also ZEISS lenses that were redone.
Yes. So then back to standard prime. This is a very old lens line, and so is the H series was brought back in. And so these are handling light in a lot different way, very differently. Where this is so striated here because of what's going on, where this is the light source. I mean, you can compare with others, and there's really nothing over here. But because of the way this lens is constructed, you have a flare that's very dramatic.
And that's caused by the barrel of the lens itself, right, for the standard prime?
Yes.
Yeah, so that you can see that that's a reflection off of the barrel. And notice, like the Primo 70, they have a much deeper matte black finish on the outside. In fact, the Panaspeeds is even less shiny materials inside. So you see the contrast level. So you see a lot more deeper blacks, and you don't lose the contrast. As soon as you put a little bit of material that's shiny or not black, like if it's even grayish, kind of lifts those blacks up. And then for the standard primes, a lot of that was metal, bare metal, right? Like you had.
I think that there's it's both. I mean, there is some bare metal, but I think most of it's painted.
Most of it's painted?
Yeah, painted.
Oh, okay. So paint can cause different looks to happen from reflections and reflectivity?
I think any kind of reflection that happens inside of a lens is going to end up. I mean, you talked about how the master primes had a different color paint.
Yes, yeah. So master primes, in comparison to like our modern day supreme primes, the blacks are definitely lifted. The paint that's on the inside of a master prime is not as deep as black as what we have nowadays, because nowadays we have like manta black and all these matte finishes that, and ZEISS has its own version of that. And when we use that, then of course it cuts all that reflectivity from happening. But the master primes, definitely the blacks are a little bit lifted. They have a slightly different tuned coatings as well. T-Star XP, it's a version created for the master prime. So definitely, I think we all take lessons from one another, right, Al?
I think so.
Pay attention to what you guys do, and you pay attention to what we do, and vice versa, and what Leica and Cooke and everyone's doing. So, yeah. So great examples over here. Cool. So I think this goes through each version, right? So this is the G series.
This will just show you the
Each
G
one close
series
up.
in comparison to the Ultra Panatar. So you see how you have these, more, ethereal, kind of bubbly, kind of, and not so much of the horizontal streak, which is, basically our signature for a lot of anamorphic lenses.
And G series has that.
And that's
that
the
blue
G
streak.
series. So yeah, you'd see that, and then you see less of that ethereal kind of look with, that bubble. But you can see how the bokehs or the bouquets are exhibited complete, in a very, see how the compression on this lens is not as great. So you have like a 1-3 squeeze as opposed to with the G series. If you go back, you can see it's a 2 squeeze. So stuff over here is really, really, really compressed. You can really see how thin the bouquets get.
Does everyone understand why the bokeh's looking like that? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. Because with the anamorphic, of course, you're taking glass elements to squeeze into a smaller section. This is 2-to-1, and you said this one was 1-3-to-1, right?
Right.
1.33-to-1.
Right.
So a little bit rounder, not as stretched out. Yes, sir. Question.
And so between the front element, like anamorphic, and the rear element, how does that affect like the lens flare?
With lens flare, you're going to get a greater lens flare, and you're going to get blue streaks if you have front anamorphic, basically cylindrical elements. But you're not going to get that in the back, and if you're not going to get it if you have front prisms. You can do anamorphic with prisms as well, and it changes the look as to how things end up. But a lot of people will argue, but I think that it's pretty well known that if you have a rear anamorphized lens, then you're going to get less characteristics that are considered very usual for an anamorphic lens. You'll be minimizing them at best.
You also get less bumps, right? Because in the front elements, you'll see it stretches out the faces a lot easier, as you can see with the G series versus the Ultra Panatar. Ultra Panatar is only 1.33 squeeze. The face looks pretty normal.
The reason for the
out.
squeeze differences is that you have different sensor
Sensors.
sizes.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to deal with a certain sensor and you wanted to cover it and you wanted to use it more efficiently, you'd use 1.3 as opposed to a 2x squeeze.
Yeah, so here's the two of them right next to each other, so you can tell the difference. Yes?
Why would you want the blue treatment in what cases?
If you're making like Star Trek, for example,
I mean,
or something creative.
In our last class, we were talking about why you would want that, and some, J.J. Abrams says, like he wants the future to be so interesting and so bright that you're like, oh my goodness, or that it's actually catching you from outside of the frame. I mean, it's. I think that some of the flares, are an offshoot of like what we want to see or how we see as humans. I mean, we don't see a lot of flares all the time, but I think that when you're in a situation, you don't want it to look like an electronic game. And that's why flares have become so important for electronic gaming. I mean, there's been whole, theses written on this one subject in order to add them after the fact, after the computer-generated images are created. And I think that with film, we kind of follow it and we kind of lead it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we're doing now with the flares. I think that people want flares for certain things. I mean, I think lots of times when I think of, let's just say an old Polaroid of a family shot, I think, oh, well, look at that flare in that lens. Look at how that's presented itself. And so now I have this kind of nostalgia, if you will, to like go back and say, well, I'd like to utilize that kind of flare in my project, because then that will give it a very, it'll give it a timely look. And I think that that's what people are aiming at many times, and then other times, like J.J. Abrams, they're looking at the future. I mean, it depends on what you're doing.
And sometimes you don't want to use flares at all. There are some DPs that don't tend to use flares, like Roger Deakins doesn't like flare characteristics because he wants you to be immersed, and he tends to use wider angle lenses further back from the action. Wants you to be immersed into what's going on and doesn't want a distraction. So doesn't want you to be reminded that there's a lens involved. Other DPs love lens flares, and they want you kind of seek through the image, to see what is going on, to make you work at it a little bit. And then for a lot of us, we wear glasses, so we see lens flares all the time. So we're like, hey, we want the rest of the world to see this too. Look at all these dots, man.
Yeah.
Don't you wish you could see this? So talking about the modern day, how is it that with the lens that like ZEISS creates, manufactures, that's not tuned or modified by Al or his team in Woodland Hills, but what if we want to do a modern lens that had flare characteristics? What can we do? Well, we talked about like ghosting, right? Which was the bouncing around of the light on glass elements. You can actually control that through optical coatings. So optical coatings are actually designed to allow you to actually transmit light properly through a lens, because theoretically light goes through those light paths that we showed you through a lens, but practically speaking, glass has reflectivity built into it. So as you polish glass, it's going to be reflective to a certain degree no matter what. So here we have examples of an uncoated, fully uncoated lens where all the glass elements are uncoated, and a fully coated lens, and you can see there's a huge difference. That with the uncoated lens, any kind of light source will really, rip into the image and show a lot of ghosting, and then lower the exposure level and up the contrast. So we patented coatings just in 1935, and we first started using T-star coatings for lenses in the 1940s, and multi-layer coatings in the 1950s. So T-star evolved. So every year, it's getting better. Why? Because we're talking about cinematography, but ZEISS makes optics for everything: microscopes, telescopes, optical equipment for medicine, orthopedic scopes that go inside your arm and shoulders to repair them. In those cases, you don't want flare characteristics. You don't want any weird looks. You want it as clean as possible. So T-star keeps evolving and getting better. But just to give you an idea of how flare works with coatings, like just notice that if you have no anti-reflective coating at all, you're going to see a lot of white light reflected back off the lens. And if it's a high-powered lens, meaning that there's a big magnification on the piece of glass, it's going to reflect quite a bit, up to like maybe 10 or 11%. Or if it's a low optical power, maybe 3 to 4%. But that's significant because there might be 12, 14, 16 elements inside a lens, especially modern-day lenses that are better than lenses even 20, 30 years ago. They have more elements inside. So there's a lot of interactivity going on. So what you could do is you can put one single layer of coating on, which will do a very good job of a certain spectrum of light. It'll do a good job of letting that light transmit, but it'll still reflect other stuff. So on this example here of the graph that we're showing that red and magenta is really not transmitting well. It's going to be reflected back out, but blue and purple or cyan and some of the green will transmit well. So this lens overall will look very cool in nature because the warm stuff will bounce back out and the cool stuff will go through. So this lens will look very cool. Not necessarily the most appealing of lenses, right? But if you have a lens that has multiple coatings, like a modern T-star coating, it's going to try to do as good job as possible over the full spectrum of visible light from ultraviolet to infrared to try to transmit all the light as much as possible with as less reflectivity as possible. So modern T-star coating is meant to do that. We still don't make it perfect because it's never nice to make things too perfect. We still leave a little imperfection, so you see some colors. Usually in a ZEISS lens you see magenta or greens are usually very slight reflections that you see. But we did something different for the Radiance. We allowed a very narrow band of blue spectrum to reflect out. So just a very narrow band. So it doesn't change overall the rest of the image, but just the blue characteristics. And you can see the resulting image is these intense blue flares, which is ghosting because it's bouncing off of glass elements and not the barrel itself, right? So a very distinct type of look that we created. We didn't want to uncoat the lenses. People try that in rental houses. You have a lot of uncoated front, sometimes rear elements. Uncoated lenses tend to exhibit weird things sometimes. Like they're great for some things, but not for others. Like they're definitely, you lose exposure stops, you lose T-stops because now instead of all the light being transmitted through, some is being reflected back out. But uncoated lenses tend to, have lower exposure level, and also they're easily veiled, meaning that any kind of light source can veil out or wash out the image pretty quickly.
Lose contrast.
Lose contrast, yeah, which is never fun. Sometimes it's cool, right? Because it acts like a filtered look if that's what you want. But again, with an intense source of light, it's not always pretty. So what we decided is that that's not what we wanted to do. What we wanted to do was create a lens series that harkens back to vintage flare characteristics, but is a modern day lens with modern, optics that's consistent, acts just like a regular Supreme Prime lens, but has a special look to it. And that's what we did with the Supreme Prime. So we actually decided to choose some elements inside the lens that we choose, like out of the 21 millimeter design, there's actually 14 lens elements. We decided for 6 of those surfaces were going to be coated slightly differently to reflect that blue around. So not all of them, otherwise we'd have like 406 ghosts, but because we have 5 elements or 6 elements, we have less ghosts. Out of the 55 individual ghosts, let's say you would see 10 of them, right? The others would be kind of hidden.
Do you know whether that's like before the exit pupil or in the entrance pupil?
The what?
Where the coatings are.
The coatings are not on the front element.
But are they before the?
Before the iris.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some. Okay.
Yeah.
And then after the iris as well.
No, none after the iris.
Okay.
Just before. So everything's before the iris. Yeah. Which helps it to keep it consistent too between each focal length of lens. Otherwise, it gets even more difficult. So we used a supercomputer here to actually, we got this computer system and software in 2015, so we couldn't even do this before 2015. But the idea of the software is to eliminate flares for most of our products. You're able to put in your optical design, your optical material, and the coating choices that you're using, and emulate overnight to see what kind of flares you would get. And the idea is to eliminate it, but we use it to actually design flares. So on the right, you're seeing an emulation of a flare characteristic for the 21 millimeter, and then it took a lot of trial and error. So we would have to, for months, put in different quantities or play around with the amount of coating that we're manipulating or things like that and emulate it inside the computer. But eventually we're able to make it so that all the focal lengths of the lenses had a consistent flare characteristic look. Now, when we tested it with the prototype, it worked. So on the left, you actually see the Sony Venice in full frame, and that's a Supreme Prime Radiance 35 millimeter. And on the right, you see the computer emulation that was used to design the lens, and you're seeing that it works really well. And you're actually able to see a very, very clear, distinct shape. And guess what? It works across the board for all the focal lengths. Now we're showing 7 on the board right now, but we now have 11 focal lengths of consistency between all the different lenses to get these flare characteristics. This does not exist in vintage lenses. There's no vintage lens series available anywhere that has this kind of consistency of an engineered flare characteristic look. It's just not possible. Very hard to do. So I think this is definitely an achievement. And then here's a quick comparison video so you can just see what the difference is between a regular Supreme Prime and a Radiance lens in terms of how it handles. You'll notice that the Radiance lenses are slightly warmer in terms of skin tone or the look, and the regular Supremes are more neutral, right there in the middle of the color temperature scale. That's because we're reflecting a little bit of blue light out, so obviously everything else transmits better, so it just looks slightly warmer in comparison. But yeah, so Al, I mean, when you're doing your Panavision lenses, like a series of anamorphic, how many focal lengths would you have in that series, and how hard is it to get the look to be consistent between them?
You know, like you say, there is some trial and error to it, and again, it's what the DP wants. Sometimes, like for a wider lens, he or she may say, oh well, I want this to be a little bit more severe than what I have in the rest of the package. So I mean, there's some variability as well with regard to the demands of the specific package. Hey, you know, I was going to ask you is like, what's the how is it going to be with zoom lenses? How will they be able to take care of the flare characteristics in the same way?
In terms of creating
all the way through the zoom range.
So
an interesting.
That's the thing to experiment on next, is like what to do with that, because zooms are of course a lot more complicated. There's many more elements inside, and you just don't get the same performance or look that you do from primes.
Yeah.
In fact, in your Primo 70s, you have zooms, but they don't have flare characteristics like the primes do they?
It depends. I mean, and basically we can make any lens flare the way we want, you know, at this point.
So I have some picture. Well, actually, I don't have that here because we were having some trouble with the USB stick. But I do have a video example that I can show you. Where's the? Yeah. So, anyways, this is Rodrigo Prieto. Talking about R&R. This is a short that he shot for the launch of the Radiance lenses.
I think that the essential part of the job of cinematographer is to choose the elements and the tools we're going to use to tell us or to not tell us. The way a character dresses, the light on the person, the composition, the texture, all these are elements that have an emotional impact. And the choice of lenses does have an emotional impact. Each project requires a different feel, or even certain scenes require a certain feel. How do you tell the story of vengeance? R&R actually means receive and release. Prisoners are admitted in, and parolees are let out. And it's kind of the beginning of a new life for both of these people. The image that came to my mind was of a person leaving prison and seeing out the windows as a person's walking down the hallway and the flare that would cause. So the light sources became a very, very important point of the story. And the lenses allowed me to utilize the characteristics of them for storytelling. And the flare represents many things in this case, but maybe it's hope, maybe it's the sun outside, it's something to reach for. I would describe the look of the Supreme Prime Radiance lenses as relatively soft, but with sharpness. These lenses don't have an aggressive sharpness to them. They feel organic. The highlights were certainly bright, but they didn't feel pingy to me. It didn't feel like a big spike. It just felt like a relatively soft highlight. Being a big format lens, I had to use a big format camera. What interests me about full frame photography is that the perspective feels a little closer to my eyesight. I find that I see more colors. I think that directing and shooting this film made it very apparent to me that I can't really separate the two. I was telling a story with the look as well. Okay, is everybody ready? Okay, let's do it again without cutting. My name is Rodrigo Prieto, and I was the director and cinematographer of R&R.
Story. So we had that question of like, well, why would you use these flares, these crazy G-series flares? I mean, I think that's the reason why is people want to have this tool set and be able to do creative things with it and help tell their story. So that's really the main reason why we go through this effort.
I mean, like you said, like earlier, like there was a frenetic quality, and there's a frenetic quality to this very beginning where the person is arrested. And that's like usually a very, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of stuff going on, and then he uses it to an excellent benefit with regard to like looking out the windows and how he's passing each of the slotted windows. I mean, it's really a nice piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you use it in a subtle way. It's not like too in your face.
No.
But it shows you like it causes excitement, it causes movement, it causes you to look a certain way, to feel like when the sun comes and causes a flare, you feel intensity just automatically. And I think that there's a lot of subtlety that goes into it. So yeah, he explained it really well too.
No, he did a great job.
He's an amazing guy, and he loves Panavision lenses, loves ZEISS lenses. The cool thing about cinematography is that you can use different tool sets and paintbrushes. We always encourage you to go to a rental house, go to Able, go to Keslow, go to Panavision, go see Al, test, try different things out for yourselves, and don't just limit yourself to one concept or idea. See what else is out there, because I think when you go to a rental house and if you have enough time, they're happy to pull out as much of their inventory as possible to help you get to the next look that you want. I found that in digital, people are pulling way more sets of lenses to test than they did in film.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That is correct. I think that people really, it's the WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, so you get to see what it is. So you go to a rental house, and if they have a lot of inventory of lenses that they can show you, then you can compare very easily. And if you know what it is you're looking for in a lens, you can put harsh light in front of the camera, or you can put some soft light behind the camera on the talent that you bring in to photograph, and you can figure out what you need in an afternoon if you're given the right elements and if you know what you're looking for.
Exactly. Cool. So any questions from the audience? Sorry, it's hard for us to see you.
Yeah.
Yes.
You guys mentioned this earlier, but like flare and its color shifting between different bodies of cameras, like Red versus Ari. What is it? Is it just like the coating on the sensor? What is it that's between camera bodies affecting the color of the flare?
There's always, on most, especially higher end cinema cameras, there's something called, we call a filter stack that's in front of the sensor. The filter stack does a few things. Normally there's an IR cut to cut infrared because digital sensors are more prone to infrared pollution. There's also usually a filtration of some kind to break up the image so that, especially in a high resolution sensor or any resolution sensor, that your image is not falling in between 2 pixels. So they kind of soften it so that you don't get moire issues. So that's another thing that goes on. And then sometimes you do other things to it, right? There's other manipulations you can do to the image on that last filter stack. Like for the DXL2, just like the Monstro, you have 2 choices of low pass filters. You have the normal one and then skin tone.
Yes.
Right. And the skin tone one actually reduces green a little bit and gives a little bit more magenta almost to make skin tones look a little bit warmer. So it depends.
For sure.
It honestly depends on the camera system, manufacturer, intent of the designer, and then how it's engineered. So there's a lot of factors that go into how it works. But it is another point of light bouncing around. So it's something that you have to contend with, for sure.
Is this only used in cinematography or also photography?
In photography, the funny thing is you don't see as much of the flares being used the same way. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One, motion. Like a lot of the flare characteristics we see are impressive, as a still, but much more practical when you see it in motion, right? Like the Rodrigo Prieto piece, we could pull a still that looks like maybe one of these images. It's not going to tell the whole story. When it's in motion, it actually makes more sense.
Yeah, and it also, like you're looking. I think your mind's eye is looking to get away from that flare too. Like, hey,
To get around it.
What is behind?
What's behind it?
Yeah, what is that?
When photography is not the same thing necessarily, but you do see flare characteristics. I mean, all still lenses are going to exhibit some kind of flare if there's a sun pointed at it or a bright light source of some kind. But most photography is not done that way, I would say. Only specialized, or if you're trying to purposely do something like that, you might see it. But if you're doing like flash photography, for example, you're never going to have a light source that's pointed into the lens that'll give you that type of flare that you get with cinematography with a continuous light source. So that's the other interesting factor too. But I could be completely wrong in my assessment because I'm not a pro photographer. But if you do see examples, please bring it up. I just haven't seen too much of flares used in photo.
I think about black and white crime photos picking up on flare.
Black and white crime photo? Yeah, because they didn't have too many coatings on the lenses and they would have bright lights to light up the crime scene. So it would flare just even them not wanting to, I guess, right? Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's a good example. Any other questions? Did you all learn something today? Yeah. You did? Oh, okay. Congrats to you. We're both here as resources for you. We'll be here tomorrow. The exhibit's going to be from 10 to 3 tomorrow, and there's still sessions afterwards. Feel free to approach, the ZEISS booth. I'll be there. Al's going to be. Are you speaking tomorrow too?
I don't think so.
Are you going to be around?
I'll probably be around then.
Yeah. So we'll flag him down. Like if you want to come find us, and we could have some more chats and tell you more about it. Al's located at Panavision, which is north of here. What neighborhood is that? I guess Fulton.
Union Square.
Union Square.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right,
like 15
right
minutes
off
from here.
Lake and Ashland.
If you haven't gone there, I encourage you to set up an appointment with either Al or Zoe to make some time to go in. Especially if you're a cinematographer and you want to test something, you should schedule when they're not busy, and then they could help you out. And they always have something that you can test and check out at that time.
Do you think individuals go back to having any events now, or is it too soon?
We had one yesterday at Panavision. Yeah, we had a rental event, so it was for rental houses, and it was like a little summit for us to be able to talk to them directly. Some manufacturers were there, but
Yeah, I think knock wood, things will progressively open again. We're going towards that direction. Yeah.
yeah, cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all.
We really appreciate your time.